friction in the form of conflict isn't a sign necessarily that something is broken. It's a sign that two separate human beings are trying to navigate and build a life together. And so, as we kind of explore today, I want to keep this in mind that the question is not whether or not you have conflict, it's what happens when you do. Can you metabolize it without resorting to humiliation tactics, without escalating, without one person having to collapse or the other one explode before the conversation that needs to happen can take place? Welcome to The Intimate Philosopher, where philosophy meets intimacy and life's biggest questions finally feel at home. I'm Dr. Emma Smith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, certified sex therapist, and existential philosophy nerd, inviting you to join me for an after-hours conversation. This is a space to slow down, pour a glass of wine, or maybe a cup of tea, and explore the messy, beautiful intersections of meaning, connection, desire, and being fully human. This is the place for real conversations about the parts of life that don't fit neatly into a box. So, grab your glass, get comfy, and let's dive in. Hi, friends, and welcome back to The Intimate Philosopher. This episode is one that several therapist colleagues and I were talking about, and that alone should tell you something because it is a common enough experience that multiple people thought that this would be a good podcast episode and requested that I record it. And so here I am at your service. If you ever want me to record or address a specific topic, please feel free to use the link in the show notes and let me know. I would love to hear from you. So today we're going to talk about conflict. And lately, you may have heard some interviews circulating with celebrities like George Clooney and Travis Kelce talking about how they, quote unquote, never argue with their partners. And when you hear that, maybe part of you thinks like, wait, what? Never? Never. Okay, now to be fair, people define arguing differently. For some people, arguing means raised voices and slammed doors. Hello, welcome to my childhood. Or for others, it can simply mean tension and disagreement or maybe a hard conversation. So when someone says, we never argue, it's difficult to know what they actually mean. It's probably somewhere along the lines of, we don't attack each other or we don't escalate or we know how to repair in a way that the relationship doesn't feel fractured or fragmented afterwards. And so that's very different from never having friction, because the truth is that healthy couples can and do absolutely have friction. They disagree, they misinterpret each other, they get irritated, they have different needs at different times and different nervous systems and different histories. So, friction in the form of conflict isn't a sign necessarily that something is broken. It's a sign that two separate human beings are trying to navigate and build a life together. And so, as we kind of explore today, I want to keep this in mind that the question is not whether or not you have conflict, it's what happens when you do. Can you metabolize it without resorting to humiliation tactics, without escalating, without one person having to collapse or the other one explode before the conversation that needs to happen can take place? Now, I have to say this part because conflict is very different from abuse. Okay? Don't get it twisted. Abuse is about power and control and fear and ongoing harm. What we're talking about today is not that. It is not abuse. It is not cruelty, and it is not driven by a hunger for power over another person. It is something that happens far more often than we are willing to talk about, right? It's this scenario where you have a loving couple, one that chose each other and respects each other and, for all intents and purposes, probably functions well in the world together, but who is gridlocked around certain topics. Okay. From the outside, they probably look solid, but inside, there are conversations that simply cannot happen without the wheels coming off because either it's the way that they're approached, really activates one partner so intensely that the issue itself never actually gets a chance to be discussed, or it happens the other way where, there's an immediate shutdown as soon as anything even remotely resembling a disagreement comes up. And it's important to note that in these scenarios, these couples are not enemies. They are stuck in a cycle. And that cycle, especially when trauma and shame are involved, is what we're going to unpack today. So there's a pattern that I see often, especially in women with significant trauma histories, although I have to say that that may be skewed just by the fact that in my career in particular, I have worked with way more women with significant trauma histories than men, and it's just a numbers game at some point. But this scenario does play out where, your partner says something imperfect, maybe in a clumsy way. Maybe their timing is absolutely less than ideal. Maybe they were even a little bit of a jerk, not out of this world, unthinkable level of jerk, but enough that it's irritating. And what happens is you don't respond irritated. Your body, your whole being just explodes. And it feels like an accusation, like you're being told that you're wrong, like you're not enough, like you're failing. And the anger comes up so hot and so fast that it's like all you can do to not completely just go up in flames right then and there. Does this sound familiar to anyone? If that lands for you, I want you to know that if you have a trauma history, that reaction makes sense. And I think that one of the most powerful things I can offer people sometimes is letting them know that even in times like this, they are not actually losing their marbles. Okay. If you grew up being shamed or disproportionately harshly criticized, made to feel less than, your nervous system may have learned that feedback of any kind equals danger, or feedback, particularly in your home environment, equals danger. So naturally, you react. But here's the part that we don't talk about, and that is that defensiveness, especially when it comes out with that kind of ferocity, can really harm your relationship. And from an intimacy standpoint, because this is the Intimate Philosopher show, is also probably killing your desire. Because when anger takes over, like that kind of anger takes over, not the spicy, like a little spicy kind of tension anger. No, like when this type of flaming hot soul melting anger takes over, the actual issue never gets resolved. And your partner often, I think, ends up feeling beat up or shut out. And then, you feel ashamed for doing it wrong again. And over time, on both sides of the equation, contempt can build, respect can erode, and erotic energy withdraws from spaces that don't feel safe. Remember all of the time that I have spent talking about sex and play and how sex is play for adults, and we only play when we feel safe, right? So if you don't feel safe being your full and imperfect self, whether it's you or your partner, you can withdraw. Now, all of that to say, it is okay if you get activated. It's not pleasant, but it's okay. And it's okay to have something trigger you. And you are still responsible for what you do next. Got it? So here's the move that I want you to take. It's actually kind of an anti move. I want you to pause. Just pause. When you feel that clench start to come up, and sometimes people say, that they're like, well, it comes on too fast. And I'm going to challenge you to catch that first moment of tension. And it probably is happening earlier than you think. And that's where I want the pause to happen. And this isn't a pause to suppress how you're feeling or to collapse and avoid the conversation. It is a pause to give yourself the gift of not completely maxing out your nervous system and to give yourself the chance to break the cycle that you're stuck in. And that means doing things that feel very uncomfortable and counterintuitive because we are trying to break out of a rut, break out of a rhythm that is not serving you or your relationship. So, what does that look like? It looks like pausing and saying to your partner, I'm getting activated and I want to stay on the same team. So, I need a moment, right? Different people say different lengths of time. I kind of follow the research and say that it's a minimum of about 20 minutes for people to kind of come back down, right? That comes from the Gottmans. And of course, I will link that in the show notes, never fear. You don't have to agree with your partner and you don't have to be calm. That's not the goal. The goal is to get you in a place where you can stay present to what your partner is trying to tell you. And, sometimes it is hard to be seen without attacking the person who is trying to love you and do this life with you. Sometimes the commentary or the critique you will disagree with. And sometimes, if you're being honest, maybe they're pointing something out that you don't like and that you need to hear. And if you can do this, if you can stay in this with the person who's trying to be in it with you, your intimacy can actually deepen. And that's where you can, even in times of conflict, keep your desire alive. Okay, now I want to speak to the other side of the equation, the partners. If you are in this dynamic, you probably feel like you can't win. You may feel like, you go to bring something up and imperfectly, sure. And when you do that, though, it detonates. And you may start to feel like, why do I even try? My partner's always angry with me. I can't say anything right. And here's where I'm going to challenge you gently. If your partner has a trauma history, particularly around shame, or if they were in their family of origin often the scapegoat, your delivery matters more than you think it does. And you may believe that you are being logical, calm, direct, but things like tone and timing and facial expression and even subtle contempt communicate far more than the words that you're saying. And I promise you, infinitely faster. Okay. So if you approach with an edge of frustration or superiority or quiet exasperation, her nervous system will pick up on that instantly. And if your partner already believes that they're failing, your irritation can confirm that person's worst fear. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm telling you that you need to walk on eggshells the rest of your life. It means that you have to decide, are you trying to be right or are you trying to be effective? And if it's the latter, then one of the things that you have to do is abandon any expectation related to timing or smoothness for now. You cannot approach someone with a traumatic shame history using criticism as your tool. It will backfire every single time. Okay. The move for you is different. Before you bring something up, ask yourself, can I say this without contempt? For real. And if not, then what do you have to do to regulate yourself first? And then try saying something like, when this happens, I feel disconnected. I want us to feel close. That preserves your status as teammates. And it reduces the likelihood that your partner is going to hear an accusation instead of what you're trying to do, which is invite them into a conversation about whatever the topic is, right? This matters because you're not responsible for regulating your partner. And at the same time, you are responsible for not escalating a pattern when both of you are in agreement that you're trying to break this cycle. Oh, and by the way, I'm saying this with the understanding because I think, when I was coming up with this topic and I was talking to my friends who are therapists, I think I'm talking primarily to people who are in couples therapy or thinking about couples therapy and are trying to figure out like how to do this while you're working on it. And if you aren't, but you're like really connecting with this conversation, I'm going to encourage you to seek out someone who can guide you through this because these are all concepts that you would be talking about in therapy. And I'm just kind of trying to break this down a little bit further so that you can have an adjunct, if you will, to that conversation because, it's hard to pull back the velvet curtain in those sessions because we only have so much time with you. So this is kind of like the expansion pack to say, hey, this is why we're telling you to do some of these things. But there is never an assumption that you are meant to do this on your own or without formal support. Remember that a podcast is not therapy. I am a therapist. I'm not your therapist. And so there's a big difference there. Okay. So let me ask out loud a question that some of you might be asking yourselves right now. And that is, Dr. Emma, why are you the one that's talking about this? Because right now, everything that you have presented sounds like almost any trauma informed therapist who has ever done any of the most basic couples therapy work would know to talk about or address. Well, I'm glad you asked, even though you didn't, because this is a one-way conversation right now. The reason that I wanted to take this on is because this whole dynamic connects to something that I think couples and even couples therapists for that matter rarely link together. And that is that defensiveness doesn't just disrupt communication, it also flattens your eroticism because desire requires mystery, but it also requires a baseline sense of admiration. I mean, if you think back to some of our previous episodes, I've talked about how we can think about desire like unwrapping a present and the pleasure that comes from unwrapping a present. It requires some tension, but it's this tension that comes alongside anticipation like, ooh, what's in the box? It's not about fire alarms signaling danger. And if every disagreement becomes dysregulating, if we get stuck in this cycle where one partner explodes and the other withdraws, the cycle of that relationship will be one where you find yourself choosing safety over spark. And, in this moment, I'm also realizing that I'm assuming that there is a dynamic where one partner is exploding and the other one's withdrawing. But you can also have dynamics where both people explode or both people withdraw. And the same issue is at the center of this because what'll happen is either people stop bringing things up altogether and or they feel increasingly ashamed of intensity. And when this happens, there's this paradoxical phenomenon that can happen, which is where the couple can actually start to fight less and seemingly appear to become more functional because they sound more polite and they're being more careful. And erotic energy cannot live in a room where both people are just braced for impact. These unresolved shame cycles, they create emotional distance. And then that emotional distance erodes what I would call polarity. Now, let me clarify what I mean by polarity, because I know that that's not a term that we use a lot in this conversation. I'm not talking about rigid binaries that may come up in other conversations about relationships. In my definition or my use of the word polarity, I'm talking about tension and specifically the good kind. So come with me on this journey. We're going to go back to elementary school, specifically science class, and we're going to talk about magnets. So, when two magnets are aligned in opposition, you can actually feel the pull. There's energy in the space between them, right? There's this charged tension, something dynamic and literally attractive. Polarity in a relationship is that charged space between two differentiated adults. And it's the tension that exists when I am fully myself and you are fully yourself. And neither of us is collapsing, shrinking, or bracing. But emotional distance grows when we start doing things like walking on eggshells, shutting down, or managing each other's reactions. And again, to go back to science class, when magnets get too far apart, the tension disappears and it just becomes flat. And in our relationships, we can become flat. We can become predictable. We can become too careful. And without that dynamic tension, desire dulls. This is how, if you ever want to know how, couples who deeply love each other can wake up one day and say, "Oh wow, we're like roommates." I think a lot of times people go looking for this one catastrophic event, and often it's not. Often it is years of avoidance. And maybe in certain relationships, it's fueled by never having the skills to fully repair or address rupture when it occurs, where the only scenario that seems to work is avoidance. And that's not true because eroticism thrives where you can stand in this attractive tension. You have to be close enough to feel it, to be connected and within each other's magnetic fields, if you will. I think I'm using that correctly, but also separate enough where you can disagree without humiliation, annihilation, or the silent withdrawal. Intensity has to be allowed, but also in a regulated kind of way because feedback is possible without one person exploding or collapsing. And I think that that's just a much more mature form of intimacy. It doesn't have to be calm all the time. And it doesn't have to be perfect communication because, I mean, who does that, right? It's much more about the ability to stay in the same room and present and on the same team, even when the old script, when your original factory settings, would have you either going on the attack or shutting down. When you can stay present in those hard moments, that's when I think you'll see admiration return, respect stabilize, and desire having the room to exist in this lovely kind of attractive tension. If part of your work is learning how to pause, how to regulate instead of react, structure can really help. It's one of the reasons that I love my 9 to Kind planner, and it is designed to help you move through your day with clarity and intention instead of chaos. I've been using mine since September, and I can't say enough good things about it. Sometimes the smallest daily systems create the most meaningful relational shifts. If you'd like to give it a try, go to 9tokind.com and use code EMMA20 for 20% off, and you'll also help support the show. So before we go, I want to leave you with this. The fact that these patterns exist in your relationship does not mean that you chose the wrong relationship or the wrong partner. It doesn't mean that you're incompatible. It doesn't mean that the spark is gone forever. It simply means that two people who learned to survive are going to also learn how to stay present and work together. This is just the next chapter of the journey, and you are being invited into something a little more elevated, a little more conscious, a little more deliberate. None of us are responsible for the environments that first shaped our reactions. And we are responsible for who we become in the presence of our beloveds in adulthood. And I think one of the most interesting or even ironic things about love is that it always seems to expose the places that are unfinished in us. And that's not an invitation to shame. That is an invitation to grow. And you cannot have deep intimacy without being seen, and you cannot be seen sometimes without feeling exposed. The work is not to eliminate activation, it is to learn how to regulate enough to stay present, to say, I'm still here, I am not attacking, I am not disappearing, I'm learning. And when you do that, even imperfectly, you can start to feel the shift. You can feel admiration start to return. You don't have to see your partner as flawless to be able to recognize that they are brave in trying to do something different and show up different for the benefit of your relationship. Respect is a very stabilizing energy. And I think while conflict won't disappear and doesn't have to disappear entirely from your relationships, you can learn to handle it with integrity. Not everything in relationships is easy. In fact, very little in relationships is easy. But the tension doesn't have to feel dangerous. It can be dynamic and attractive in a magnetic kind of way. So, if you know someone who is going through something like this, maybe it's a loving couple who just feels stuck in a painful loop. Maybe you are part of that loving couple stuck in that painful loop. Please share this episode with the person who needs to hear it. If this conversation was meaningful to you, even leaving a 5-star review can help this work reach other couples and other clinicians who are looking for it. Remember, your internal homework is about embracing who you are becoming. It's not about fixing brokenness. Those are two very different things. Okay? I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me for this after hours conversation. If something in today's episode made you pause, get curious, or see yourself a little more clearly, share it with a friend and keep that conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring that messy, beautiful space between meaning and being human. I'll see you next time.